Hello and welcome to this edition of World at War. I'm your host, Mohammed Saleh. The battle for Bakhmut will be one of the defining battles of the war in Ukraine, just due to the intensity of the fighting that has been witnessed for the control of this small but strategic town. Once home to over 70,000 people, Bakhmut has now been reduced to a burnt-out shell. Almost everyone has now fled from their homes. Russia has thrown everything and the kitchen sink to try and capture this key strategic town. With the help of Western weapons, Ukraine had for months been planning a spring counter-offensive, but it now suddenly found itself on the back foot. Kiev has ordered for the evacuation of the city of Kupiansk, a city that it managed to recapture from the Russians in its counter-offensive last September. But the question, of course, is this: to what extent will the battle line shift in Ukraine as the snow has now begun to melt? This video that has now gone viral was released by the chief of the deadly Wagner group. The location in the video has been verified by buildings as seen in satellite imagery. Since September last year, the Wagner mercenaries have attacked Bakhmut in wave after wave of coordinated attacks. And now, Yevgeny Prigozhin claims that the Wagner mercenaries haven't just surrounded the strategic city, but have also managed to breach its very center.
I am addressing the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Alexandrovich Zelensky. Dear Volodymyr Alexandrovich, Wagner PMC units have practically surrounded Bakhmut. Only one road is left open to Ukrainian forces. The pincers are getting tighter. If earlier the professional Ukrainian army fought with us, today we see more and more old people and children. They fight, but their life under Bakhmut is short. 1 or 2 days. Let them leave the city. The city is practically surrounded.
Russia has used its air power to bomb Ukrainian positions in Bakhmut. The Ukrainians are still putting up a dogged resistance. Outgunned and outnumbered in the bloody street-by-street fighting, the defending Ukrainians are refusing to surrender.
We need more weapons. It is the most important. More tanks, artillery, armored vehicles. We have experience, but no tools to push out the enemy.
We won't give up Bakhmut. We will hold to it until the very last. Glory to Ukraine, dead to the enemies. Thank you.
This map will give you a glimpse of how the battle lines have hardly shifted ever since the first snow of winter fell. But the snow is now melting. Russia is now on the cusp of a hard-fought, bruising victory. And in the coming days of the spring offensive, military experts expect that the battle lines will begin to shift again. In an incident that has taken everyone by surprise, on the 2nd of March, a settlement in Russia's Bryansk region came under attack. 2 people were killed and a child was wounded. Footage released by the Russian Federal Security Service shows a car that was badly damaged in the cross-border raid. The Kremlin has termed the attack as an act of terror, perpetrated by certain Ukraine-backed nationalists, with intelligence provided by the United States of America to carry out a daring attack such as this. Washington has pumped the battlefield of Ukraine with its top-notch weapon systems to aid Kiev. But the Pentagon is now going to great lengths to dissociate itself from the cross-border raid into Russia.
Couple things. I have seen some press reporting from Russian officials, first of all, alleging that the U.S. was somehow providing information to enable these types of attacks. What I would tell you, first of all, is, again, I don't have any information in regards to whether or not the Ukrainians have conducted these type of operations. I'd refer you to them. I can say definitively that the notion of the U.S. providing intelligence or information to the Ukrainians to target locations inside Russia is nonsense. We are not at war with Russia, nor do we seek war with Russia. Our focus is purely on supporting Ukraine to defend itself, and so that's what we'll continue to do.
The United States is not formally at war with Russia, but what cannot be denied that it is the combined military-industrial complex of the West which is aiding and arming the Ukrainian soldiers to take on the Russians. And with the beginning of the spring offensive, Russia has managed to gain an advantage at Bakhmut. While politicians make big statements and go home, The people who pay the ultimate price in any conflict are the common residents of a country. WION's Anas Malik is presently in Ukraine, and he's interacting with the common people who've been caught in this bruising conflict that is now dragged on for more than a year. Away from the headlines and away from the media glare, the pain of being uprooted, of losing your loved ones, of being turned into a refugee, of taking your little children away from the familiarity of your home and to try to desperately to survive is felt most acutely by people who've got nothing to do with politics and have got nothing to do with the war. Our next report gets you details of what life is like in the shadow of war in Ukraine.
Only the most unfortunate and only those who have no resources and nowhere to go are still stuck on the front lines in Ukraine. Despite the relentless boom of artillery close by, 47-year-old Svetlana had vowed to stay on until the very end, in the hope that the war would end soon and life would go back to being normal again. Supplies have dried up, and the families in the Chasiv Yar area now depend on humanitarian aid for even basic supplies such as bread.
We are leaving. We remained until the very last. We wanted to stay. But how can we? It is time to go.
None of these people have anything to do with the war, but most of them have either lost a relative or a friend.
I had a flat in the 8th district of Bakhmut. It doesn't exist anymore. I worked all my life to buy it. I do not fear anything anymore. I was afraid when I was 14 years old. Now I am 70 and I have 7 grandchildren. Do you understand, my friend?
WION's Anas Malik has been reporting from Ground Zero. In the city of Irpin, one of the worst affected in the initial days of the war, Anas met with Andriy. Andriy's family has long gone, in search of safety, to a strange and a new place. And their once safe home is now just an empty shell.
I'm standing outside a house here in Irpin, and what you see right next to me is a crater, and this explains the sheer magnitude of the destruction that has been caused. The house that you see behind me is not livable anymore, and it is because of the shelling and the attacks that had been ongoing, the conflict that raged on in parts of Irpin. The house is completely not livable. It is shattered. You see the window panes that are shattered, shattered glasses, blown out windows, and let's just walk in.
To start all over again in a new place is not easy. It is not easy to forget the memories one has of one's home. But Andriy's family has done it not once, but twice. Originally from Crimea, he had taken his family and fled the peninsula when Russian troops occupied the Crimean Peninsula in 2014.
I felt very bad when I became in my house. No windows, no door, very dirty. Our furniture was broke, like our world, our family world. I felt like, I don't know how, I felt very, very bad.
Coming back to Irpin to see his home again has not been easy. But in his heart of hearts, Andriy feels he and his family may never come back and live in their home again.
Wall was destroyed.
Houses like these would be found in abundance across Ukraine. But for Andriy and his family, it was double the tragedy. First in Crimea and now here in Irpin. It's a stark reminder that the world remains at war for him. With the hopes of bouncing back even stronger and with the hope of rebuilding his life and his house, Andriy says that he will not be leaving the country. Anas Malik in Irpin, Ukraine for WION. World is One.
The tensions in the Holy Lands have now risen to a fever pitch. This past week, hundreds of Israeli settlers descended onto the Palestinian town of Huwara on Sunday night. They attacked Palestinian families, shot one person dead, and also torched dozens of homes and cars. The violent rampage took place in one of the most militarized zones in the world. The Israeli army was missing from action, and even one of the Israeli generals later termed the violent rampage by the Israeli settlers to be nothing short of a pogrom. Our next report gets you the details.
The trouble began on the 26th of February. A Palestinian gunman driving in a car shot dead 2 Israeli brothers. The attack took place near Huwara, a site of regular friction between Palestinians and settlers. There was no immediate claim of responsibility for the attack, which occurred as the Palestinian and Israeli security officials were meeting in Jordan to discuss ways of lowering tensions. But by the time night fell, hundreds of Jewish settlers, most of them masked and heavily armed, attacked Palestinian homes in Huwara, a Palestinian village north of Ramallah. In the violent rampage, 1 Palestinian was shot dead. More than 350 were injured. Several Palestinian homes and more than a dozen cars were set on fire. The violent mob was seen pelting stones on Palestinian homes. The Israeli settler violence on the Palestinians, even to Israeli commentators, brought back memories of Kristallnacht, a reference to the repeated incidents of horrific violence, arson and vandalism the Jewish communities were subjected to in Nazi Germany.
لا أنا بكت بالغرفة قاعدة على تليفوني وجارتنا جارتنا طلعت بس ما لقيناهم اللي هم بكسروا الدار فإحنا بكينا بالغرفة ما توقعنا إنهم يكسروا الشباك.
The settlers attacked and broke the windows. We moved down to the floor. We started to hear sounds from outside the house. I moved to the windows in our room, but there was shooting, so I moved down to the floor. Then they broke the windows. My mother moved us to a corner because there was no safe place. They broke all the windows while we were inside.
The Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas held the Israeli government fully responsible for the rampage. The next day, suspected Palestinian gunmen shot dead Ilan Ganeles, an Israeli-American student from Connecticut. In the evening, hundreds of Israeli and Arab protesters in Tel Aviv rallied against the Huwara mob violence and the Israeli occupation of West Bank. They tried to block traffic and scuffled with the Israeli police.
All over Israel, here in Tel Aviv and elsewhere, we are protesting against the horrific pogrom committed by the extremist settlers in the West Bank yesterday. They came because they have the support of the government. They have the support of high-ranking Kahanist ministers serving in the government, and they are deepening the occupation, deepening the bloodshed, and bringing this country into a spiral of violence and escalation. We came to raise our voice in protest, Jewish and Palestinian citizens of Israel, to say end the occupation and advance towards an Israeli-Palestinian peace.
On Wednesday, Israeli forces conducted a daylight raid in the Aqaba Jabbar refugee camp adjacent to the city of Jericho. 1 Palestinian was killed and 3 others were arrested on the suspicion of involvement in the fatal shooting of the Israeli-American Ilan Ganeles. As to the action regarding the mob violence, 10 people, including a minor, have been arrested by the Israeli police. An Israeli general chose to describe the Sunday's rampage as pogrom. This year alone, as many as 63 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces, whereas 13 Israelis, including a policeman and a Ukrainian tourist, have been killed in Palestinian attacks. With the Muslim holy month of Ramadan and the Jewish Passover festival merely weeks away, foreign mediators have resorted to calls for a return to calm in Palestine. But are these calls adequate to stem this new surge in settler violence in the Holy Lands?
The turf war between the Taliban and the ISIS Khorasan group has gotten more intense. On the 27th of February, the Taliban announced that they've managed to kill 2 key Islamic State commanders in their hideout in central Kabul. The Taliban are hardline fundamentalists, but they term the ISIS Khorasan's ideology to be simply too extreme. On the other hand, the ISIS Khorasan terms the Taliban to be apostates, not really good Muslims, because of their willingness to negotiate a peace deal with the United States of America. At this moment, there are an estimated 3,000 ISIS Khorasan fighters in Afghanistan who've been accused of carrying out repeated suicide bombings in the country. The question, of course, is this: in this bitter turf war between the Taliban and the ISIS Khorasan group, who is winning?
2 key Islamic State commanders were killed by the Taliban security forces on Sunday. The overnight counter-terrorism raid targeted their hideout in central Kabul. Taliban spokesperson Zabihullah Mujahid identified the slain ISIS commander as Qari Fateh, who was the intelligence and operations chief of Daesh in Afghanistan. The Daesh, or Islamic State Khorasan, is an Afghan affiliate of the Islamic State. Elaborating further, the Taliban spokesman stated that Qari Fateh had masterminded the recent terror attacks against diplomatic missions, mosques, and other targets in Kabul. Islamic State Khorasan, though, has not immediately commented on Taliban's claims of killing its top leader. Interestingly, the announcement came just hours before the United States put out a new report, claiming that up to 3,000 Islamic State fighters were still present in Afghanistan. The Taliban spokesman also confirmed that the Islamic State Khorasan chief for the Indian subcontinent, Ijaz Amin Ahangar, along with his 2 other commanders, had been killed in a Taliban counter-terrorism operation on the 14th of February. Ijaz Amin Ahangar was also known as Abu Usman al-Kashmiri. In addition to these killings, the Taliban claimed to have detained a number of Daesh members, including many foreigners. Since their return to power in Kabul in August 2021, Taliban have periodically carried out operations against the Islamic State Khorasan. How effective have the Taliban been in their counter-terrorism efforts? Well, the United States is skeptical. On Monday, the U.S. State Department issued the 2021 country report on terrorism, noting that Islamic State and other regionally focused terror groups maintained an active presence and conducted terrorist activities in Afghanistan. Taliban has dismissed the reported presence of thousands of Islamic State Khorasan fighters in Afghanistan as baseless. Originally an armed militant group in Pakistan, the Islamic State Khorasan belonged to the umbrella organization Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. Fearing persecution at home, they fled across the border to Afghanistan, pledging allegiance to the Islamic State in 2014. By the arrival of spring in 2015, Islamic State officially absorbed the terrorists into their own network and announced their expanding footprint into Central Asia as Islamic State Khorasan. Subsequent years saw the decline in the fortunes of Islamic State, which resulted in drying up of financial and personnel support for Islamic State Khorasan as well. But if United Nations is to be believed, the Islamic State leadership in Syria and Iraq has since gone underground and still maintains contact with Islamic State Khorasan.
Thousands of people in the Democratic Republic of Congo are fleeing from their homes as the M23, which is a rebel group linked to neighboring Rwanda, has seized more territory in the conflict-ridden eastern part of the country. More than 5 million people have been internally displaced in the fighting, besides thousands who have been pushed to the brink of starvation. Our next report gets you the details.
Democratic Republic of Congo ranks among the 5 poorest nations in the world. The impoverished nation has been battling insurgency in its east for decades. More than 120 rebel groups are fighting with national armed forces for power, land, and valuable mineral resources. Preeminent among these rebel groups is M23, a largely Congolese Tutsi militia who shot to prominence in 2012 when they briefly captured Goma, the capital of northern Kivu, before being driven out to neighboring Rwanda and Uganda. Kinshasa accuses its smaller neighbor, Rwanda, of backing the M23 rebels and fomenting the trouble in its eastern frontiers. A charge refuted by Kigali. Fighting spiked in late 2021 when M23 rebels, largely dormant for nearly a decade, staged a comeback and captured large swaths of territory in northern Kivu. Last week, the M23 rebels captured the frontline hotspot, the village of Mushaki in northern Kivu province.
We spent the night with a lot of worries, and it's been a few days now. But today the fear has exaggerated because before the rebels were very far from the city, but now they are very close to us. They've already arrived in Mushaki and Karuba. This disturbs us. We wonder where they're going. Where are we going to run to? Who to run to for help? This problem is beyond us.
Consequently, a fresh wave of civilians is heading towards the provincial capital, Goma, to seek shelter. Desperate to get out at any cost, they travel on foot, motorbikes and bicycles, carrying whatever they can of their belongings. Congolese army insists that theirs was a strategic withdrawal from Mushaki, and that they have withdrawn their artillery from the town of Sake in order to avoid civilian casualties. A baby clinging to his shoulders and 6 other young children in tow, Safari Hangi walked for hours in search of safety. His family is among hundreds fleeing through Sake, which they no longer consider safe and secure.
We saw many soldiers leaving Mushaki without knowing why they were leaving there. There were so many of them that we were scared, and when we heard a lot of gunshots, we couldn't remain there. No one could stay in the city. This is why everyone decided to flee. The whole population left.
Despite pledges by both sides to abide by the Luanda ceasefire agreement, the situation on the ground paints a different picture. On the 1st of March, the Congolese youth demonstrated outside the French embassy against the arrival of French President Emmanuel Macron, who they accuse of supporting Rwanda at the expense of their country. The renewed fighting in eastern Congo only exacerbates the growing humanitarian crisis and could possibly bring more chaos to Central Africa.
Thanks for watching World at War, and if you want to reach out to me with any comments, feedback or suggestions, you can do so by tweeting to me on my Twitter handle that you see on your screens. I'm your host Mohammed Saleh. We'll meet again next week.